Hi, I'm Larry Хон. This is the third in a set of 3 tapes which accompany a book I've written about framing an entire house. Now in tape 1, we built the floor. In tape 2, we framed the walls. Now here in this final tape, we'll put the roof on. Here's a preview of what you're going to see. We start by laying out for the ceiling joists, then roll and nail them off. Next, we determine our rafter lengths. Mark the rafters and cut them one by one. After setting the ridge, we can nail off the rafters. Finally, we sheet the roof and show how to join 2 gable roofs together. One of the things that most of us want is a roof over our heads. Well, we're about ready to build a roof on this house. But before we do that, we want to show you what that roof's going to look like. Here we have a model of just a simple gable roof. The main parts of it are this common rafter here. Then we have a ridge that runs the full length of the building. Here we have some ceiling joists. These ceiling joists and the rafters run 16 inches on center. In between, we've run some blocks. Now let's take a look at this common rafter in a little more detail. We've had to make a couple of cuts on it. Here at the top we have a ridge cut. That allows this common rafter to fit right snug against that ridge. Down at the bottom now we have a seat cut. We cut this notch out so this common rafter could fit right down on that plate. Now the pitch of this roof is 4 and 12. Well, what does that mean? It means that for every 12 inches that this rafter runs in on the level, it rises 4 inches. It's as simple as that. So how did we know how long to cut this rafter? Well, one way to do that is this. You measure the span. The span of a building is from the outside to the outside. Here we have 5 feet. Once we know that, we can use a book of rafter tables. We open it to the pitch, 4 and 12, and then we go over to the common rafter column, down to 5 feet, and we see that the length of this rafter is 2 feet, 7 and 5/8 inches. Now, that's the distance from the center of the ridge down this common rafter to the outside of the building. Of course, it doesn't include this rafter tail. Now, back up here at the ridge. This common rafter doesn't run to the center of the ridge. So we had to shorten the length of all these common rafters 3/4 of an inch. That's half the thickness of this ridge. Back on these joists, you'll notice how we clipped this joist so it wouldn't stick up above this rafter. Now these joists are really important. They get nailed into this rafter, and actually the rafter and the joist form a truss that help hold this entire building together. Now on this end joist, you'll notice that we didn't set it on edge, rather we laid it flat. That way we have backing on the underneath side for drywall. Round on this side, we cut a notch in it right here so we could slip in this common rafter. On top of this flat joist, we nailed in these big gable studs. These gable studs close in this whole end of the building. And right here now, we have what we call a sway brace. This brace keeps this whole rafter frame from racking back and forth. Here at the edge of the building, we blocked in between these rafters. This type of block is held flush with the outside of the building. We had to rip it down a bit so it wouldn't stick up above the surface of that rafter. Now, down at the other end of this model, we run in a different style of blocking. This blocking, we run square with the rafter. That means you don't have to rip it down. And when you're running in siding or stucco from below, you don't have to notch your material around these rafters. Now, this isn't a complicated roof, and neither is the one that we're going to build up here on this house. We're going to begin that process by laying out and nailing in these ceiling joists. Now I need to be really careful when I'm up here walking the plates. I wear a good soled shoe and my motions are slow and deliberate. Laying out for these ceiling joists, it's easy. Hook a long tape at one end of the building, draw it out, marking every 16 inches. You also want to indicate to which side of the layout the ceiling joist will fall. Now, our 2x6 joists can't span the entire width of the building, so they lap over the interior walls in the middle, but where there are no middle walls, Joe nails 4x6 beams which act as bridges and carry some of the joists. I want to make sure I mark this plate every 16 inches just like the other one, but the joists on this side will nail to the opposite side of the layout line, so I make sure to indicate the correct side with my keel. I also mark layout in the middle, on top of the wall plates and on top of the beams. Now, in this house, the ceiling joists don't run the entire length of the building. They're interrupted at this point because there'll be a cathedral, a high ceiling, over the living room. Well, our ceiling joist layout is finished. It's hard to see it up there, so I built this model to show you what's going on. We're using 2x6 joists, and they run in pretty much like the joists that we ran here on this first floor. Here, these 2x6s represent our exterior walls. Our ceiling joists come off of those walls, and they land on this interior wall, and they lap right here. We ran our layout from the outside of the building on both sides, 16 inches on center. Now, here on this wall, our joist will fall in front of that layout. On this wall, it falls to the back of the layout. On the center partition, we have a joist on each side of that line. They're going to lap in the middle, and they're going to look just like that. There ain't one of them that's light, I'll tell you that right now. Well, Joe and I have taken a vote, and we've decided we don't like moving these ceiling joists around. But if you're a carpenter, you have to move the wood, wet or dry. And we've got to carry these ceiling joists into position. Our building's about 33 feet wide, so we have 18-foot joists coming from the back side and a 16-footer from the front. And here, over the kitchen, just requires one length, since the adjoining living room has a high ceiling. Here on the top, we're starting to nail the joists in place. The first one goes down flat for drywall backing. We side each board for the crown, put the crown up, and hold the joist 1.5 inches from the edge, since there'll be a block between the rafters, and toenail them to lay out. Here I'm marking and cutting pressure blocks, which help support ceiling joists where they butt up against the beams. Joe is taking these blocks to the middle of our building. Here's how they work. A ceiling joist nails in, then a pressure block with 3 16-penny nails. You could use joist hangers here. There's a lot more about that in the book. Then another joist is toe-nailed into the beam, tied up against the block with 16s. The pressure blocks help support the joists and space them 16 inches on center. Okay, that's it. Now, whenever there's an interior wall parallel to the way the joists are running, I nail a joist flat on top of the wall, leaving 1 inch hangover on each side for drywall backing. Still in the middle of the building, Joe is toe-nailing ceiling joists on layout with 16-penny nails. Then he returns, toe-nailing the other joist to the wall, and ties the 2 joists together at the lap with 2 16-penny nails. That's the code. Here's another way to run on backing for drywall. This is a 2x6 wall. We nail on a pair of 2x4s, letting them hang over on each side. It's often necessary to interrupt a run of ceiling joist in order to box out a hole for an attic access or for a stairwell. In this case, we have an attic access hole up through a closet. We ran headers across 2 interior walls for support. Now, if your hole was larger, you'd want to double the headers and the side joists. And speaking of larger holes, this is a big one. It's over the kitchen, and we're framing a spatial light well for a large lighting fixture that will be above the countertop below. I'm nailing together beams made out of pairs of 2x6s, which fit into these joist hangers. These hang off double-up ceiling joists that Joe has already positioned.
Yeah.
Then we fill in each side of the hole with short joists. At the far left, I'm nailing against pressure blocks which are nailed to a 4x12 beam. To the far right, the end of Joe's short joists right on top of the wall plate. We finish up by nailing 2x4 backing on top of the light well. Now, Joe and I have a lot of experience walking up here, but for safety's sake, we like to use a catwalk. This is 1x6, leftover bracing stock. Once it's positioned mid-span on the joist, we run a layout on it to keep our joist straight. Then we nail it off with 8-penny nails. Now, everywhere a joist crosses an interior wall, we toe nail on each side. This really strengthens the entire structure. Besides that, it's the code. We're down here on the garage floor, cutting 2x8 rafter ties. I mark one end with a rafter pattern. More on this later. Extend the line, then clip it so it won't stick up above the 2x6 rafters. Now it's just a matter of setting them up on the plates. Most codes require tie on 4-foot centers. You want to be careful up here. You're working on a 2x4 wall. Pay attention to what you're doing. This garage doesn't have any ceiling joists, so the purpose of these rafter ties is to tie the exterior walls together.
I'm glad they don't sell this lumber by the pound, Joe. Goes like yay.
Now, letting the building itself be our guide, I mark and cut the rafter tie to length and clip it just like the other end. And drive a 16-penny toenail, one on each side. And by the way, just like all joists, we were careful to put the crown up on these boards. This piece of 2x8 on the end here allows us to nail on a 2x4 strong back across our rafter ties. The strong back maintains spacing and ties everything together. This house has a cedar porch out front, and in order to put ceiling joists above the porch, Joe and I have to first put up posts and beams. They are supported at Joe's end with a trimmer. My end is mitered and toenailed to the top of the post. Under these long beams, we add posts in the center for support. This high rake wall is filled with windows and doors, so we couldn't cut a brace into it. We're nailing on these shear panels to strengthen the wall before putting up our porch ceiling joists. We find it easier to sheet walls after they're raised. The ceiling joists which go across the porch are 2x4s. They get nailed off to a 2x4 ledger which is held flush to this chalk line. The chalk line is snapped flush with the top of the walls. We nail off the ledger with 16s into each stud. Now, the span on this porch isn't very great, so 2x4 joists are adequate. We pre-cut these joists to length, and you can see that again, we use a pressure block between each joist. The porch takes a little jog here, so these joists are a little shorter. Time to cut some rafters for this gable roof. We'll start out here in the garage. The first step is to measure its width, or span. Then I look up the correct length in my rafter book. These garage rafters are 16 inches on center, so for this garage, we need 32 boards racked up on the horses.
Okay, we want to make sure all our crowns are up. Here's one that's down, so we're going to turn it over. Take a look again. Everything looks pretty good now. This one here, Joe.
The next thing we do is to flush up the ridge end by holding a 2x4 tight against the end and moving each board up against it with our claws.
We've got all our rafters racked up here. We're ready to cut them. Need a ridge cut here and a seat cut. Now, to do this, we had to make this template. Let me show you how that's done. You can use this framing square. The pitch of this roof is 4 and 12. So we set it over here on 4 and 12 over here. And then you can make your ridge cut mark right here. Or you can use this small square. It has a pivot point right here, and this is your common rafter line. Move it till this 4 for 4 and 12 is flush with this edge of the board. And then you make your ridge cut mark right here. Now we're going to move down about a foot and make this seat cut. Set it on 4 and 12, just like before, and make that mark. Now we're going to leave about 4.5 inches height above plate. Take your square and just square off of that plumb mark for the level cut of the seat cut. This is going to cut out, just like this one, for our seat cut. With our tape hooked on the ridge end, we mark the length of our common rafters taken from the rafter book to the stock on both sides. The line we snap is where we'll make our seat cut. Back at the other end, we're using our rafter pattern to mark all our ridge cuts. Then we just work through the stack. It doesn't take long to make the cuts. Now with the same rafter pattern, I can mark the seat cuts. I align the mark on the pattern with the line on the stock and mark the bird's mouth. With the stock on its side and a couple of cuts, this rafter's ready. The tails are cut once the roof is framed. We've marked and cut these rafters using basic tools, a template and a saw, but there are other ways to do it. Carpenters now have available a wide variety of tools that we can use to cut rafters. A lot of these tools are much more efficient than the ones we used to use. Instead of having to cut one rafter at a time, we can rack them all together like this and make one cut all at once. Now, I put together here a few sample rafters so I can show you how some of these tools work. This first tool is half circular saw, half chainsaw. Set at 18.5 degrees, you can make the ridge cut in one pass. It's a great tool, but be careful with it. This is not a one-handed saw. This is a skill saw with a dado head on it. It's built for one purpose, to make seat cuts in one pass. Don't use it for anything else. The newer models of this saw come with a better guard. Here's another way to make seat cuts in a rack of rafters. With a regular saw set to 18.5 degrees, I make the heel cut. Then cutting from the other side, and using a saw with a swing table, I cut the level part of the bird's mouth. Here's another way to support a whole rack of rafters. Just 2x6 cleats, which are spaced to hold up a 2x12. This stack will be for the main part of the house. Now in this stack, we need to crown all the rafters down since we're gang cutting them. Here I'm flashing them up to a straight edge, but they don't have to be perfect with this method because we snap a line back from the end for the ridge cuts. All right, let's get the length of our common rafters.
33.5 inch.
That's the span. So here in the common rafter column, we got 17 feet 4 3/4, and then a half inch is 1/4 inch. 17.5, and we'll take off 3/4 of an inch. 17.4 1/4. This mark is to the edge of the building where our seat cut will be. But first we need to make our ridge cut. The saw is set to 18.5 degrees for our 4 12 pitch, and cut the whole stack. We'll cut the seat cut with the dado saw, like we showed you a moment ago. You don't need production tools to cut a roof, but it sure does speed up the operation. Joe and I are scattering the rafters around the building, ridge end up. Remember the model roof? We had blocking between the rafters. That's what I'm cutting here, and a chop saw helps speed up this job. Here I'm cutting notches every 32 inches on these rake rafters. They go on the very end of a gable roof. 2x4 lookouts pass through these notches and support the overhanging barge rafters. More on this later. The holes are simple to make. First, kerf the outside edges. Then plunge cut. Before Joe meets me up on top, he first leans up a straight 2x4 here on the gable end. We nail it on edge against the end near the center of the building. We'll use this stick to help plumb up the rafter frame. The next thing is to haul up a couple of pieces of long straight 2x8 ridge stock. Notice that we nailed down a wide plywood walkway. Now we're hauling up the rafters. So we don't bury the ridge, we only pull each rafter part way. Now it's important to watch your step. Make sure you have solid footing. Now the roof can start taking shape. This is the rake rafter with the lookout notches cut in it. Joe toenails one end flush with the edge. Then I bring up the end of the second rake rafter, and Joe nails it off. Now we come down to the end of our first piece of ridge, and we set another pair of common rafters. Joe nails his end to a ceiling joist, and the same on the other side. Then we slip the ridge between the pairs. Up we go.
Raise the ridge beam high.
Now you'll notice that this rafter nails only halfway on the ridge. That leaves room for the next piece of ridge.
We want to make real sure that this ridge is level before we nail in the rest of our rafters. Here we got 62 1/4. We can make sure it's level by just hooking our tape on that joist, the bottom of the joist, and measuring up under this ridge. Here we got 62 3/4. Now that means this ridge on this end is a 1/2 inch high, so we got to drop it a little bit. We're going to do that by coming down here to the low end. We'll just mark a 2x4 right there underneath that ridge and make a cut. We'll just tack this one in here temporarily. Now we can go down to the other end and drop that one. Here's another leg cut the same length as that one behind us. There's the 1/2 inch gap. We drop this ridge, it'll be level. Cut her loose, Joe.
It only takes a slight adjustment to bring the ridge down to level, and then we can nail off this rafter. You'll notice it has no tail. That's because this is where the main roof joins the garage roof. We call a rafter without a tail a mule. Then I nail off the ridge post. These will also keep the ridge from sagging, so I like to put one every 10 feet or so.
Well, the ridge is now level, so we want to make it plumb. To do that, we nail in a permanent sway brace. Now, to make this ridge plumb, all we have to do is move the rafter over till it barely touches this long straight edge. Just like that. Go ahead and nail it, Joe.
Now you can see we placed this sway brace so it doesn't fall on a rafter layout.
Perfect. That's it. Good. Here we go.
Working efficiently means we set all of our ridge before going back and nailing off the remaining rafters. Well, all our ridge is set, the sun's out, and we're nailing off the common rafters. Joe picks up each rafter to make it easier for me to nail here at the ridge. Holding the rafter flush with the top of the ridge, I drive in 2/16. About every 10 feet, Joe drops down and nails off a rafter at the plate line to help hold the ridge straight. Later, we'll come back and finish blocking and nailing. When nailing the opposing rafters, no need to toe nail. Angle the 16s through the ridge into the rafter. We're nailing off the rafters at the plate now, and here's how it goes. First, one of the blocks with the bevel on top is positioned. It's nailed off with 2/16. Then a toenail into the plate, and 3/16 into the joist where they lap. Then 2 nails to hold the back end of the block. Here it is again. The block is placed, snug up the rafter, toenail into the plate, nail off the block, and nail the lap. And turn around then and finish off the block. That's the code, and that's the way it goes all the way down. Well, the garage rafters get the same treatment. I begin by building up a bigger catwalk in the middle so we can work safely. Then the rafters are handed up. These rafters are 16 inches on center, but many plans call for rafters to be 24 inches on center. Now, just like any other roof, we set the ridge between two pairs of rafters. Measure for level and adjust if necessary. Nail in mid-span rafters and fill in between. And finally, block a nail along the plate. We're ready now to close in this end with our gable studs. What we do is we measure over 7 inches right here from the center of this ridge and make a mark. That'll leave 14 inches right here between these two gable studs so we can put in an end vent. Then we measure the length of our first gable stud, which is 43.5 inches. That's all we need to know. We're ready to cut our gable studs now, and it's a real good time to use up some of this scrap lumber. We're working on a 4 1/12 pitch, just like this. So each gable stud that runs down this pitch is going to be 5 3/8 inches shorter than the previous one. And we call that the common difference. Let me show you what that means. Gable studs cut in pairs. Our first set is 43.5 inches. Now our next set, the common difference of these gable studs, is 5 3/8 of an inch. So we mark that. So how did I find the common difference? Well, this is explained in detail in the book. Now we set our saw at 18.5 degrees. That's the degree of a 4 1/12 pitched roof. These gable studs are nailed 16 inches on center. And when you're nailing off the top end to the rafter, be careful not to push it up. Every gable end gets closed in with gable studs. Here I'm finishing up the north end of the house. We're back here on this model. We want to show you a few details. You remember we cut notches in our end rafter? Well, this is the reason that we did that. We nailed in these 2x4s. They're called lookouts. They come from this first inboard rafter through this notch and they hang out over the outside edge. Then we cut them to length so we can nail on this barge rafter right through those lookouts. The barge rafter on this side, it'll nail into these lookouts, just like that. I've sighted down the rake rafter, made sure it was straight, and now I nail the lookouts with 2/16 through the top into the rake rafter, and 2/16 through the end of the inboard rafter. Now before we sheet this roof, there's a few things we have to do. These 2x6 rafters here, they're overspanned. they're just not heavy enough to carry the weight of the roof. So what we're going to do, we come underneath here and we're going to put a brace. This brace is called a purlin. It goes right up underneath these rafters and nails in place. Then we're going to brace it off this wall down here. The first thing I do is toe nail through the rafters into the top of the purlin. I know where to nail because we mark the layout on the purlin. This will keep these rafters nice and straight. One piece of purlin isn't long enough, so we add another piece, lapping 2 or 3 rafter bays and nail them together. At the gable end, Joe nails the purlin to a gable stud and further supports it with a 2x underneath. Then we support it with a notch 2x post at least every 8 feet. And this spacing depends on the amount of weight the roof will support. For more information now, check your local code. Finally, Joe toe nails the bottom of the post to a load-bearing wall. And we do the same on the other side.
Let's do it together. Everybody together.
This is a good time to find lots of help. This is a glue lamb beam which supports the cathedral ceiling over the living room. A glue lamb is an engineered beam made up of 2x6s laminated and glued together under pressure. Then we lift one end onto a 6x6 post and into its pocket. The other end is supported by a long 4x6 post which sits over a foundation pier. Now you can see that the top of this beam sits right underneath the existing ridge board. The rafters from each side will rest on top. Back at the other end, Joe nails a 2x6 to either side of the post and beam to lock them in place. Later, he'll do the same with the other post. Now we're setting rafters over the kitchen area. You can see the rafters run long here at the top, no ridge cut. But at the bottom end there's a regular seat cut and it nails in like any common rafter. Now the reason these run long up here is because they'll lap and tie with the rafters from the other side and be cut later. Now we're cutting the rafters to go over the main part of the living room. These have to be 2-bayed because they clear span without any support in the middle. Here I'm ripping the tails to the width of a 2x6 so they match the rafter tails on the rest of the building. One by one I push the rafters up to Joe. We cut a 2-inch deep seat cut here on top so these 2-bays will plane in with the 2x6s. Down here, they block and nail like a regular rafter. The rafters have all been nailed at their lower ends only, so I can go ahead and cut these top ends off without hitting a nail. Now the idea here is not to make perfect cuts. We just want to saw these ends down below the level of the sheeting. Up on top of the glue lamb, Joe's blocking and nailing everything together. 2 16s tie the rafters where they lap, and then toenails into the blocks and beam.
Now come get him right for endo.
We're working now on positioning a pony wall for the high wall under the cathedral ceiling in the living room. It serves as a purlin for the 2x6 rafters, and it provides backing for drywall. We're done finally with a lot of that heavy work up on the roof. So we're ready now to run on our barge rafter. And here on the ends of these rafters, we've got fascia. Well, these are pieces of trim. People are going to look at those for a long time, so we want to do a real good job at that. That's why we waited until now to mark and cut these rafter tails. Once these rafter tails are cut and our fascia is nailed on, it's going to be perfectly straight. On this model, we want to give it a 14-inch overhang. That's why we made a mark at 12.5 inches, because our fascia is 1.5 inches wide. Now that we've got it marked, we're using this piece of rafter template. It has a 4-12 plumb cut on it, and we're marking our rafters. Once they're all marked, we'll just come back and cut them. You'll notice we cut a miter at the end of the barge rafter. This makes for a neat joint with the fascia, and we nail it together with galvanized finish nails. You'll notice how right here we held our fascia down almost a 1/2 inch below this rafter tail. That way the fascia planes in with the pitch of the roof. So when we put on our sheeting, you can see how everything comes together real nicely. After snapping a line and cutting the lookouts to length, Joe and I hang the barge rafters. They're 2x8 cedar, the same size as our fascia. Make sure you're well braced before leaning out over the edge. We nail off with 16-penny galvanized, 2 at the ridge and 2 into every lookout. Yeah. The ends run wild and will be cut later. Next, the fascia. Fascia hides the ends of the rafters and gives a trim look to the house. Here's a mitered corner, and again we're using hot dip galvanized 16s. Eventually we'll nail off our fascia with 2 nails into each rafter. You can see here how we hold it down a 1/2 inch, just like on the model. On a long run of fascia, joints are mitered and nailed at a rafter tail. Even if the wood shrinks, the joints still look good. Well, it's not long now till we have sheeting on this roof. And all this rain we've been having will keep on the outside, not on the inside. Now, we're out here in the garage, but all our eaves from below, they're open. So instead of running this sheeting material clear down to this outside edge, we like to cover these eaves with a starter board. Here it takes 3 pieces. That way, when people look from down below, they'll see a nice looking piece of wood. Once the starter board is on, then we can sheet the rest of the building with the sheeting material. You can sheet your overhang with plywood, but for a more trim look, use these long lengths of starter board. And if you need to butt them, do it over a rafter. On the gable ends, we run the boards in the other direction, across the lookouts, and cut them in place. Finally, we can sheet the roof. The first thing we do is snap a control line at 48 1/4 inches above the starter board. These are sheets of 1/2 inch OSB, oriented strand board, and engineered wood. Plywood is also commonly used. We nail them down with 8-penny sinkers. At the end of the building, we often have to make a cut. Just slap the panel you're cutting over its neighbor, snap a line, and make the cut with the saw set to the right depth. We also snap a control line for the first course on the main roof. We work each panel to the line, lapping the end to the middle of the rafter. If it's off a bit, nudge the rafter over and nail it in place. And as we keep sheeting, we make sure to stagger the joints by starting every other row with a half sheet. We've got enough of our roof sheeting down now, so we can tie these two roofs together. It's actually a very simple process. The first step is to extend this ridge here, the garage ridge, over to the main roof. When that ridge touches, then we can mark it for length right here. Then we have to get a level cut on it. That's simple. Mark it like that. That gives you the level cut. Once that ridge is cut, it's going to look like that. And then we'll have a valley, one that runs down each side. The first thing we do is nail our ridge at both ends. And then snap a line where the blind valley will be. We're using scrap 1x6 for our valley support. We eyeball an angle cut at one end, position it, and cut an angle at the top end. Now when we nail it down, you'll notice that we hold it back from the chalk line about 3/4 of an inch. That way the sheeting on top of the jack rafters will plane in with the rest of the roof. To give the bottom of the jack rafters good bearing, we double up the 1x6 supports. Here's our rafter pattern for these jack rafters. This is our level cut, and here's our plumb cut. It's going to fit just like that. We measure the length of our first rafter, here, 54 inches. We give ourselves a mark right there. We'll put a level cut on that, just like that. And a ridge cut or a plumb cut right up here at the top. Okay, this gets cut. So now we have to set this at 18.5 degrees. That's the pitch of the roof. And one by one, we measure, mark, cut, and nail them in place. A couple of 16s through the ridge into each one, and 2 16-penny toenails into the supports. This is one fairly easy way to tie the two gable roofs together. We're ready now to cut this sheeting to fit into this valley. Now one way to do that is just move it over till that lower end touches the main roof. Then here at the top, you can measure straight across until your tape touches the roof. We got 44 inches. We'll transfer that measurement down here to the lower edge of the board. 44 inches. Then we'll snap a chalk line. Once we cut that, it's going to fit right into the valley, and we can use this cut off end for a pattern to mark the rest of our boards. Now it's just a matter of cutting and filling in the rest of the pieces. You know, it's a great feeling when the roof is finally sheeted. Our basic framing is finished. And it's not long now, we'll have shinglers here. Now, Joe and I, we've been carpenters for a long time. But there was a time when we didn't know how to build. An entire project like this, framing a whole house, in a way it is pretty complicated. But it's true that complicated projects are made up of simple steps. And what we learned how to do, you can learn how to do.